Hi, this is Justine Toe. You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. Well, today we're going to be talking about eating, and specifically eating in community, because you're always eating with other people. Now, we're going to explore this theme through some interviews with two women who work at World Vision. Both, funnily enough, are called Ruth. We've got Ruth Dernley and Ruth Padilla de Borst. In their own ways, both of these interviews draw our attention to the ways in which our eating practices always involve other people, sometimes for good or ill. Now, first up, we've got Ruth Dernley, World Vision Australia's campaign leader for trafficking in persons. Here's her interview. So Ruth, thank you so much for joining us on Life and Faith.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, today on the program, we're talking about the way that eating joins us to other people. And I guess what I mean by that is that, many of us don't grow our own food. We buy it at the shops. But, of course, when we buy it, it doesn't just get there by chance. It involves the efforts of so many people, from people who grow the food, harvest it, process, transport it. And it does turn out sometimes that somewhere along that chain of production, people are being exploited in order to get that food to us. And that is certainly the case for something like chocolate, isn't it?
Yes, it's something that has been raised over the last decade or so, that we've been very aware of the use of forced child and trafficked labour in the supply chain of our chocolate. It comes from starting at the very beginning of the supply chain of chocolate in the harvesting of the cocoa. 70% of the world's cocoa is harvested in West Africa, and it's mainly by smallholder farmers who are living in rural communities. Poverty is a real issue there, and they heavily rely on the income generated from cocoa sales. And as it's not a commodity that they can necessarily eat and survive off themselves, they're largely influenced by any fluctuations in the market price for that commodity. And as a result of that, children may often work alongside their parents in the industry, and this can be incredibly damaging to them, both from keeping them out of school and not getting the education that they need to thrive and build themselves out of poverty in the future. It can also be very physically demanding and quite damaging to their personal development. In the most fundamental terms, that comes down to, if the adult workers are paid an appropriate wage, then their children wouldn't need to work, and there wouldn't be that level of exploitation within that community. And that's something that we can really affect within our own purchases, and also from the companies that we purchase from. There's also other cases of exploitation in that industry which are much more deliberately exploitative, such as children being trafficked from outside communities into cocoa plantations, where they're forcibly made to work using dangerous equipment in slave-like conditions, really, for little or no pay.
You've alluded to the kind of terrible conditions that force children into these positions. But can you give us also an insight into what these work conditions do to their dignity?
If you've only ever experienced that disadvantage, it would be very difficult to be able to conceptualise what a different way of life would be like. And so individuals and communities get into this cycle of just experiencing only this negativity, and it can be incredibly damaging to their dignity and their ability to grow out of that situation.
It's a reinforcing cycle, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And in the situations where it's much more deliberately exploitative, there is huge risks to people's psychosocial development, and understanding of their place in society and in the world when they're deliberately being exploited by other people.
I've read that exploitation in the cocoa industry was recognised as an issue back in 2001, which, is like over a decade ago, and yet we're still, we are seeing some progress, sure, but it's nowhere close to being eradicated. Why is that the case?
Addressing child labour and trafficking is always going to be a complex issue, and you need a long-term sustainable approach to do so. In some instances, some of the reasons that it takes so long to do it is that there's so much education needed about the risks of child labour and the long-term effects that can have. And in communities where they're so reliant on any income they can bring in, every family member has to work. And it can take a long-term cultural shift to see that the benefits of an education will have on that child in later life to help them build themselves out of poverty at a later stage. But also, I think there has been some level of reluctance and apathy to an extent by the international community. And as you said, in 2001, this was first noted by the global cocoa industry that, yes, this issue did exist, and they made a commitment to addressing it. Now, we knew that wasn't going to happen overnight. World Vision always called to see full transparency about the sourcing of ethical cocoa by 2018. And we felt that that was a realistic time frame where the companies could actually make this sustainable change. However, many still haven't taken the steps needed to thoroughly address it. There's been a lack of transparency through some companies about what is being done. So it's been very difficult for organisations like World Vision and the public to hold them fully to account. We are seeing this change, which is fantastic, and there's steps in the right direction to make timetable commitments to addressing the issue. And as more consumers and the Australian public get behind these calls for better business practices and start prioritising buying from companies that are providing more ethical products, we're seeing bigger shifts and bigger improvements are beginning to be made.
Well, I'm just speaking for myself. You walk down the supermarket aisle and you're presented with an array of choices. And, I'm just shopping when I have the time to do it. I haven't necessarily done all that reading to work out which companies are sourcing their goods ethically and all that sort of thing. It feels like the lack of transparency that you mentioned is this major issue. It seems really hard for the public to get information about these practices. Do you have any tips for us in this direction?
Absolutely. I mean, it can be very hard and it can be very overwhelming, but I would say don't give up hope, and the smallest of changes can really make a big impact. First step would be looking for ethical certification logos on products. I think that's a really good start. So organisations like Fairtrade, Rainforest Alliance or UTZ, UTZ certified, all work to benchmarks that allow for certain labour standards to be upkept and do not tolerate forced or child labour within the supply chain. And they only give their brand to companies that uphold that within the supply of certain commodities within that product. So that's a really good first step when shopping. There's also a wonderful app by the Ethical Consumer Group in Australia called Shop Ethical. You can download the app onto your phone, you can buy an actual hard copy book from them, which has done a lot of the work for you on issues from forced and child labour through to environmental issues, animal testing, GM, looking at all the different issues that make a company ethical and sustainable, and just give you a tick or a cross as to the standards that company is upkeeping, so you can help you choose which company to purchase from.
Now, when we talk about something like eating in community, I guess this has a really kind of positive or life-affirming vibe to it, and at its best it can be. But when we talk about, I guess, the exploitation and the trafficking that can be involved in the way that we get our food, I guess you've helped us draw our attention to, I guess, the dark side of what it means to eat in community. So can you give us your version, perhaps, of a really positive expression of eating in community, especially in relation to how we source our food?
Yeah, I think it is very easy to get overwhelmed by all these issues and hear just all the negativity around it and want to sort of close your eyes to it all. But there are so many examples of positive actions, and every day, actually, and it's a real privilege in my role to hear about local people making small changes that collectively have really huge impacts. And everything from, I hear of supporters of World Vision who are learning about the issues and now only putting ethically certified chocolate in fundraiser boxes that they have around the office. So it's something that they're sharing, but in a positive way, and then educating other people around that. To students organising fair trade dinners, only using ethical certified products and using that as a fundraiser and a way to raise awareness of these issues. And there are all the time different options that we can take with our own life, like committing to one meal a week where you source everything in that meal from the Shop Ethical guide. And invite friends round, share it with other people, tell them about what you're doing and why you're doing that, and making those small steps. I see that it's a real privilege to be able to take part in this way, and we have the freedom to be able to make these changes for other people in other parts of the world, and we can do that in such a simple way through what we consume on a day-to-day basis.
That was Ruth Dernley, World Vision Australia's campaign leader for trafficking in persons. They're talking about the exploitation and trafficking of people, often kids, that underwrites some of the food we buy, but also ways that we can affect positive change in the ways that we eat in community. Now we're going to change tack slightly with our next interview with Ruth Padilla de Borst, World Vision International's Director of Christian Formation and Leadership Development. Because sometimes we say you are what you eat, but it's also true to say you are who you eat with. And I was particularly interested in talking about this with Ruth. A few years ago, she gave a presentation at Q Ideas in New York City, and she was talking about how everyone is welcome at God's table. So I wanted to hear her particular thoughts on what it means to eat in community. Here she is on a recent visit to Sydney. Now, when Jesus is talked about in the Bible, it says that he came eating and drinking. But he also had a habit of challenging a lot of the social rules of his day concerning who he ate with. Mm-hmm. Now, what does that tell us about Jesus and, more broadly, I guess, God's heart for the other?
Jesus is criticized for eating with the wrong people, for doing things at the wrong time with the wrong people in the wrong place. He challenges a religiosity that justifies exclusion. That rejects people because they're a certain gender or a certain ethnic background or a certain social status. And Jesus instead just hangs out with all those wrong people as an expression of God's love for all.
So that was Jesus back then. Who is the other today?
Well, you would know, all of you listeners would know far better than I do who all the others are in Australian society. But I suspect it has to do, especially with people that are coming from other latitudes, from other places. It could be your asylum seekers. It could be neighborhoods with people from other religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, social backgrounds. And too often we tend to exclude and just close ourselves up into our own particular comfort ghettos of people that are like us. And but the call of the good news of a God of open, expansive love is that has to be made visible in the very concrete things and sitting around the table with people who are totally different from us.
You said in a talk a few years ago that Christians should, and here's a quote from you, celebrate their unmerited inclusion at God's table by welcoming people who look, think, eat, speak differently from them. Now, I think that today in Western society, Christianity is often seen as having a problem with difference. But is that true?
I think there are examples of people who would use Christianity as an excuse to exclude, but that the heart of following Jesus, which is the call of every Christian, is actually totally contrary to that tendency. And it is to express in very concrete ways that embrace of God of all people. And of course, it's not easy. It wasn't easy back in Jesus' time, and it's not easy today. But it is something that God can work in us to make us like Him.
And how does then sharing a meal around a table, how might that contribute to such a welcoming of difference?
If I described our Christmas Eve table when I was growing up, we had, I grew up in Argentina, but our table was the most unlikely mix of people. We had a Polish schizophrenic woman who lived alone, and she came every Christmas Eve, and a Czech family whose son was in jail, and the man who I was always scared of, who had a glass eye, who was a widower, and we would all sit around the table and celebrate Christmas. To me, that Christmas has to do with that, the good news that we're all welcome, and so. And to do that at a very practical level, and opening up a home for many is just that's I can talk to somebody out in a cafe or in the street, but to open my home and have them sit at my table and share my food, that's a bigger challenge. But I think it's one that God's grace can make possible for us.
Again, that was Ruth Padilla de Borst. I guess what we've been talking about today is the question, how do our eating practices reveal who we call our neighbour and our friend? Eating tends to join us to other people, not only in what we eat, which is often possible only through the efforts of other people, but also with whom we eat. When Ruth Padilla DeBorst talks about everyone being included at God's table, I guess she's presenting a theological dimension to the discussion we had with Ruth Dearnley. Together, they point to a positive vision of what eating in community can ultimately look like, a banquet where everyone is welcome, everyone is equally honoured, and justice is as much a feature of the table as good food and the company of friends. Such a vision can transform our eating practices, and this doesn't only help us to eat well, but also to live well with others. I hope you've enjoyed the program. We'll see you next time on Life and Faith.